In the frozen winter of 1885, the grand limestone mansion of Elena Fairchild rose above Fifth Avenue like a glittering jewel, its polished windows and marble facade concealing a truth so disturbing that New York's most powerful men would spend decades trying to erase it. What the public saw was an elegant widow's grief, a woman mourning the sudden death of her brilliant husband. But hidden beneath the silks, the chandeliers and the social columns of the New York Times was something far darker: conspiracy, betrayal, and a chain of deaths so carefully arranged that they appeared almost like fate itself. The official story spoke simply of a woman's madness of suicide brought on by hysteria. Yet scraps of correspondence sealed away for generations in the crumbling walls of an old Wall Street building tell a far more sinister tale. They speak of the Gilded Age elite men who built their fortunes not only on iron and rail, but on orchestrated death, and of the one woman who dared to bring their crimes into the light. Before we step deeper into the mystery of Elena Fairchild, I want to pause for a moment to thank all of you watching tonight. This channel has just passed the incredible milestone of 1,000 subscribers, and that's only possible because of you, the community that gathers here to wander through these long-forgotten corridors of history with us. Thank you so much for listening, for sharing, and for keeping these mysteries alive. If you haven't yet subscribed, I'd love for you to join us on this journey. Your support helps bring more of these hidden stories to life, and together we can uncover even more of the past that others tried so hard to bury. Now let us return to New York City, 1885. The city was at the glittering height of the Gilded Age, a metropolis where fortunes were minted in hours and lost just as quickly. On Wall Street, steel magnates, railroad kings, and banking dynasties strutted through marble corridors with the confidence of emperors, while only a few blocks away, immigrant families crowded into dark tenement rooms, fighting for survival. And along Fifth Avenue, where palaces of limestone and carved granite rose in defiance of time, the Fairchild Mansion stood proudly among them. Its soaring ceilings imported European antiques, and French Second Empire elegance marked it as a temple of wealth and ambition. Within its walls lived Theodore Fairchild, known on the exchange as the Oracle of Broad Street. At just 45, Theodore had mastered railroads, mines, and manufacturing alike, building a fortune so immense that rivals whispered of unnatural foresight. His uncanny timing, buying just before crashes, selling just before collapses, ruined competitors and enriched him beyond measure. By his side was Eleanor Catherine Brennan, who had become Elena Fairchild the day she married him in 1878. She was the daughter of a modest Boston merchant, transformed in a single evening into one of New York's reigning social figures. But she was more than ornamental. Elena possessed a keen wit, an earnest love for her husband, and a gift for weaving together the social web that sustained his empire. Her charity galas funded orphanages. Her dinner parties became the stage where titans of finance struck quiet bargains over wine and cigars. Together, Theodore and Elena seemed untouchable, a pair at the very center of America's new aristocracy. But the truth, as we will see, was far more fragile. For everything would begin to unravel on the last evening of Theodore Fairchild's life. At the heart of the mansion stood its crown jewel, Theodore Fairchild's private study, paneled in dark oak, lined with shelves of leather-bound tomes, and dominated by a towering safe that held his most guarded documents, the room was both a sanctuary and a fortress. To outsiders, it was a place of intellect and control. To Elena, it was a space she respected but never fully entered, knowing that her husband's world of finance thrived on secrecy. Their marriage had begun as an arrangement, a union of two families seeking to elevate their names. But in time, it had blossomed into something genuine. Theodore, for all his sternness, valued her insight. He often sought her counsel in matters of society, for Elena had a gift for reading people, for seeing beneath polished surfaces, and in turn she absorbed much of his financial wisdom through their conversations, though always careful to remain within the boundaries that 1880s society demanded of women. They had no children, an ache quietly carried by Elena, but together they filled their lives with duty, ambition, and a sense of purpose that few couples in their circle could rival. New York in 1885 was a city of contradictions. Its wealthy elite dined under gilded ceilings, savoring 7-course feasts, while the working poor crowded into tenements where disease and hunger stalked every corridor. The Brooklyn Bridge had recently been completed, hailed as a triumph of progress. Yet labor strikes and industrial tragedies reminded all that such progress was bought with blood. In this landscape, men like Theodore Fairchild wielded extraordinary influence. With a single decision, he could shift the livelihoods of thousands, even alter the fate of entire industries. What Elena did not yet know was that Theodore's remarkable rise carried a price far darker than she could imagine. The evening of November 17, 1885 began outwardly, at least like so many others in the Fairchild household. Elena had spent the afternoon ensuring every detail of their business dinner met her husband's impeccable standards. Silverware gleamed, crystal glasses caught the glow of candlelight, and the kitchen produced roasted duck, imported oysters, and Theodore's favorite Charlotte Russe for dessert. These were no ordinary gatherings. Within the Fairchild dining room, America's future was quietly shaped over cigars and clinking glasses. That night's guest list was formidable. Harrison Kensington, the silver-haired banker who controlled much of the city's railroad financing. Marcus Cromwell, sharp-featured and cold-eyed, whose shipping empire dominated the eastern seaboard. And James Wright, the youngest of the trio, already wealthy beyond measure from his family's textile mills. Elena had seen these men dozens of times before, enough to recognize the subtle lines of authority. Theodore commanded the table. The others deferred to him almost like officers before a general, but this evening felt different. Beneath the polite conversation, a tension hummed, sharp as a drawn blade. The usual banter about market shifts and political intrigues was broken by half-heard whispers. Elena caught fragments: the Pittsburgh situation, the problem resolved permanently. When she attempted to ease the mood with a gentle remark about recent society gossip, the sudden silence stung her like a slap. Faces turned downward. Theodore himself, normally quick to soothe her discomfort, seemed distant, his complexion pale, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his glass. Sweat clung to his brow despite the November chill. When she leaned close to ask if he was unwell, Theodore brushed it off as the strain of a complex negotiation. Yet, the look in his eyes was haunted, carrying a weight she had never seen there before. Course by course, the meal dragged on with a growing unease. Voices dipped into guarded murmurs whenever sensitive topics arose, leaving Elena stranded in her own dining room, excluded from conversations she once shared. By the time the Charlotte Russe was set upon the table, the tension had thickened into something suffocating. Theodore lifted his spoon, but before it reached his lips, a sudden gasp tore from his throat. His face twisted with agony. The silver spoon clattered against porcelain as his hands clutched his chest. Elena rushed toward him, her heart thundering, but before she could reach his side, Theodore pitched forward onto the table. Crystal-shattered wine spilled like blood across the linen, and the most powerful man in the room lay motionless beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Elena's scream pierced the marble halls of the mansion as she fell to her knees beside her husband. His eyes were frozen wide with terror, lips twitching as if to form words that never came. Only a ghastly rasping sound escaped his throat. At once Harrison Kensington assumed command. His voice was steady, commanding. "Cromwell, fetch the physician. Wright, clear the room." Servants scrambled to obey. James Wright took Elena gently by the arm, his manner calm, yet strangely insistent, steering her away from Theodore's slumped figure. "Dr. Henley will know what to do," he assured her, though his words felt curiously rehearsed. Dr. Purcell Henley arrived within 20 minutes. His bag clutched tightly, his face composed in that practiced mask of sympathy cultivated from long service to New York's wealthy elite. Elena hovered in the doorway, her heart pounding while Henley bent over her husband's motionless form. His hands moved with brisk precision, feeling for a pulse, checking the chest, watching the eyes. The examination lasted only moments, though to Elena it stretched into eternity. Finally, Dr. Henley straightened, his tone solemn yet curiously final. "I'm afraid Mr. Fairchild has passed. The strain of his work, his age, his recent complaints of chest pains. I believe we are looking at a fatal heart attack. Sadly, these tragedies are not uncommon among men burdened with such responsibilities." The words struck like a blade. Her world, her partner, her confidant. Her love collapsed into silence. Theodore Fairchild, the man who had seemed untouchable, was gone. Through the blur of grief, Elena dimly perceived the others already setting plans into motion. The three guests spoke in hushed tones with Henley. Papers were mentioned, arrangements made. Their composure, their swiftness seemed unsettlingly businesslike. But she was too broken to question it. What her tears blinded her from was the fleeting language of glances exchanged between Kensington, Cromwell, and Wright. She did not see Dr. Henley's near imperceptible nod when Kensington leaned in close to whisper. She did not register Cromwell quietly lifting Theodore's half-drained wineglass from the table, nor Wright's subtle signal to the butler who swept the dining table clean with unusual urgency, erasing every trace of the meal. The days blurred into morning. The city's newspapers framed Theodore's death as tragedy and warning. Wall Street's most brilliant oracle felled by the relentless strain of high finance. An empire builder cut down in his prime. Editorials praised his genius, lamented the loss of his brilliance, and cautioned other financiers not to push themselves beyond human limits. Elena received the endless parade of condolences, her black silk veils soaked with tears. Yet beneath her grief, a needle of unease remained lodged in her mind. She could not forget the terror etched in Theodore's eyes in his final seconds. nor the strange urgency with which his friends, men she had trusted for years, had moved that night. Something had been wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Weeks passed. The funeral was held, the mausoleum sealed. And then came the endless paperwork. Theodore's empire was vast, tangled, and demanding. Elena found herself thrust into a new role she had never sought, guardian of the Fairchild fortune. Cornelius Dalton, Theodore's trusted attorney, appeared at her side like a benevolent uncle. With gentle patience, he guided her through stacks of papers, stocks, deeds, and contracts. Always careful, always reassuring, always reminding her that she could, if she wished, leave these matters in more experienced hands. But Elena was no naive socialite. She read, she studied, she signed, but she also learned. And the deeper she waded into Theodore's empire, the stranger it all became. There was brilliance in his decisions, yes, but also something unnerving. Time after time, she saw investments perfectly timed with calamities elsewhere. He sold railroad stocks mere days before accidents crippled their value. He bought mining shares just before rival companies suffered sudden cave-ins. He expanded into shipping lines only after competitors' vessels sank under mysterious circumstances. At first, she clung to the belief that Theodore's genius had been foresight, his timing uncanny but natural. Yet, as she pieced the records together, the coincidences piled too high. Patterns emerged. Accidents that seemed less like accidents. Fortunes that grew precisely when others were ruined. And the thought began to take root in her mind, chilling her heart. What if Theodore's fortune had not been built upon brilliance alone, but upon something far darker? The timing of Theodore's fortune was not merely fortunate, it was impossibly precise. As Elena sifted through his papers, the thought returned again and again. No man, no matter how brilliant, could predict disasters with such uncanny accuracy. It was as if Theodore had known in advance which rail line would collapse, which mine would cave in, which rival would suffer a sudden death. Her suspicions deepened when she discovered a locked drawer in Theodore's study. Neither she nor any member of the household staff had ever seen it open. It took the skill of a locksmith to pry it free, and when the iron latch finally gave way, Elena stared into the shadows of secrets her husband had hidden from everyone, even her. Inside were documents that shattered her understanding of his world. Stacks of newspaper clippings chronicled industrial accidents, train derailments, and unexpected deaths of rival financiers. Each clipping was carefully dated and annotated in Theodore's neat, deliberate script. Alongside them were coded telegrams and letters written in cryptic shorthand, signed only with initials. They spoke of problems requiring decisive solutions and of conflicts that needed to be resolved permanently. These were not the letters of legitimate businessmen. They read like blueprints for calculated sabotage, the cold mathematics of destruction, disguised in polite language. One letter in particular made her blood run cold. Dated just 3 weeks before Theodore's death, it was written on thick, expensive paper with no letterhead. Signed simply HK. It spoke of the Pittsburgh problem, the very phrase she had overheard at that fateful dinner party. The letter promised that our associate has been contacted and understands the urgency of the situation, and concluded with a chilling reference to a substantial payment for services rendered. Elena's hands shook as she read the signature again and again. HK. Those initials matched only too perfectly with Harrison Kensington, the dignified banker who had comforted her during her darkest night. Could the man who had spoken gentle words in her parlor have also orchestrated her husband's downfall? The possibility was unthinkable, and yet the evidence lay before her eyes in Theodore's own handwriting. From that moment forward, her grief transformed into obsession. Through the bitter January of 1886, she spent countless hours in Theodore's study, sifting through his records, mapping dates, drawing connections between market shifts and disasters. With every thread she untangled, a pattern grew clearer. Theodore's empire had been built on deliberately orchestrated catastrophes. Accidents that crippled competitors, deaths that left fortunes vulnerable, collapses that seemed far too convenient to be random. But as she pressed deeper into the labyrinth of secrets, Elena found herself growing increasingly isolated. The glittering world of New York society, once so open to her, began to close its doors. Women who had once begged for invitations to her dinners now greeted her with stiff politeness. At charity galas, conversations died when she approached. Friends' eyes slid away from hers as though she carried some unspoken contagion. Even Dr. Purcell Henley, the very man who had pronounced Theodore dead, began calling on her with suspicious regularity. At first, his visits were framed as medical concern for a grieving widow. But beneath the professional courtesy was something disquieting. His questions were too pointed. "How do you spend your time these days, Mrs. Fairchild? Are you dwelling too much on painful matters? Have you been experiencing nervous spells?" Whenever she mentioned her study of Theodore's financial records, his face would tighten, his tone darken. He spoke of concern for her delicate constitution, hinting that such matters were not fit for her mind or her health. And then came the most disturbing realization of all: she was being watched. Unfamiliar faces began appearing along Fifth Avenue, loitering near the mansion gates, their eyes tracking her when she left in her carriage. Footmen she did not recognize slipped among the household staff. Letters she had placed carefully on her desk vanished only to reappear in different drawers. She began to feel the walls of her home, her sanctuary closing in as if invisible hands had already decided her fate. Theodore's study had begun to betray subtle signs of intrusion. Papers she knew she had arranged neatly would be shifted ever so slightly, as if unseen hands had rifled through them in her absence. The sensation of being watched grew so constant that Elena questioned her own sanity. Was it paranoia born of grief, or was there truly someone in the shadows studying her every move? As the ice of winter melted into the rains of spring, her doubts hardened into conviction. She no longer believed Theodore's death had been the result of a weak heart. The documents, the coded letters, the inexplicable timing of his investments, everything pointed toward a darker truth. His wealth had been purchased with blood and sabotage, and his death had silenced him before he could reveal too much. The conspiracy surrounding him was vast, its architects powerful, and Elena, widow of the fallen titan, now stood in their way. Sleep brought her no peace. Night after night, she lay awake, haunted by the same questions. Who is watching me now? How far will they go to protect their secrets? By April of 1886, her sorrow had hardened into resolve. She would no longer be a passive mourner. She would become a seeker of truth. Her first breakthrough came from the most unlikely of allies. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook who had served faithfully in the Fairchild household for 6 years, entered the breakfast room one morning with uncharacteristic nervousness. Her weathered hands twisted the edge of her apron as she whispered, "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild, but there's something I've been holding back about the night. Mr. Theodore passed. God rest his soul." Elela Nena set aside her papers and gave the woman her full attention. Margaret had always been sharp-eyed and loyal, and in these months of isolation, her presence had been a comfort. The cook swallowed hard before continuing. That night, after Dr. Henley left the house, I saw him by the garden gate. He was speaking with Mr. Kensington. They didn't know I was watching from the pantry window, but I heard it plain as day. Mr. Kensington said, "The dose was perfect. No one will ever suspect." Margaret's voice trembled as she went on, and Dr. Henley answered, "Just remember our agreement about the widow. She must never learn what we know." Then they shook hands, ma'am, as if sealing a bargain. I have not slept right since. The words struck Elela Nena like a physical blow. The dose. There could be no other explanation. Theodore had been poisoned, murdered with such expertise that the symptoms mimicked a heart attack. And worse still, the very men who had comforted her in her grief, Kensington and Henley, had orchestrated it. Her sorrow crystallized into something colder, harder rage. Now the details of that night fell into place with terrible clarity. Henley's rapid arrival, as though he had been waiting for the call. The calm precision with which the guests had managed the crisis. The nervous glances exchanged across the dinner table. None of it had been coincidence. They had been waiting for the moment when their plan would unfold. Empowered by Margaret's revelation, Elela Nena pressed deeper into her investigation. She began making discreet inquiries, piecing together fragments of gossip and financial records. The men who had sat at her husband's table emerged in sharper, darker outlines. Harrison Kensington, pillar of respectability, had profited from at least a dozen railroad collapses, each suspiciously timed. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire had expanded only after competitors were crippled by fire sinkings and bankruptcies that seemed almost orchestrated. James Wainwright's textile mills thrived as rival factories, mysteriously faltered their fortunes, evaporating in a string of inexplicable mishaps. A chilling pattern emerged. These men prospered not despite misfortune, but because of it. Again and again, their wealth grew in the very shadow of ruin that consumed their rivals. And now Elela Nena realized with grim certainty she was next on their list of problems to be resolved. Their astonishing rise in wealth and influence was not luck, nor even ruthless competition. It was murder, meticulously disguised as misfortune. Business rivals did not merely fail, they perished. Accidents on railway lines, unexplained. Fires, sudden illnesses, apparent suicides, each coincidence masked an assassination. What Elela Nena uncovered was nothing less than a murder-for-profit enterprise, a cabal that thrived on bloodshed. And at the heart of it all had been Theodore. His sharp, analytical mind had not been predicting the tides of commerce, it had been orchestrating them. Every stroke of fortune, every timely purchase, every windfall gain was calculated atop the ruin of another man's life. The gilded security in which Elela Nena had lived had been built on foundations of violence. The fortune that had carried her into New York's highest society was, she realized, with horror bought with murder. As her understanding of the conspiracy deepened, so too did her peril. Isolation settled around her like a closing trap. Invitations to salons and galas ceased. Old friends declined her company with excuses too flimsy to disguise their fear. Acquaintances who once crowded her dinner table now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. And more troubling still, her movements. Her words, even her thoughts, seemed no longer private. Letters vanished from her desk, only to reappear slightly displaced. Strange new servants entered her household, vouched for by agencies conveniently tied to Harrison, Kensington. Responses to her correspondence contained answers to matters she had never dared commit to ink. Eleanor began to grasp the terrible truth she was being watched constantly. Her home turned into a cage, her nerves frayed under the strain. The creak of floorboards jolted her awake. She checked locks 3-4 times before bed, yet still lay sleepless ears straining for the footfall of intruders in the halls of the mansion. Every shadow seemed to conceal eyes. Every silence throbbed with menace. And then came Dr. Henley. His visits grew frequent, his manner insidious. What he framed as concern for her delicate constitution grew into veiled threats. He pressed for examinations that intruded far beyond propriety. His suggestions became darker still. Perhaps Mrs. Fairchild required rest at a private sanitarium, where her fragile mind could be tended by specialists. The implication chilled her. If she resisted, they would brand her insane, lock her away, and strip her of voice and credibility forever. The noose was tightening. Eleanor knew she raced against time. To hesitate was to lose everything: her freedom, her sanity, her very life. She needed proof, irrefutable and damning enough to expose the men who closed in on her. But each day heightened the danger. The elegant home that once rang with laughter and music now loomed around her as a prison. She was both captive and prey. The game of cat and mouse had begun, and Eleanor knew that only one side could survive. By the summer of 1886, her investigation revealed a rot that reached far beyond Kensington, Cromwell, and Wainwright. This was not the conspiracy of 3 men. It was a vast network that stretched into the highest echelons of New York society. Judges who bent the law, police officials who suppressed inconvenient investigations, editors who buried damning stories, even members of the Board of Health who signed false death certificates, all were complicit. For at least a decade, the city's very institutions had been servants of this hidden empire. And then came her most devastating discovery. Behind a false panel in Theodore's office, safe, she found a leather-bound ledger. The ledger, every line penned in Theodore's precise and disciplined hand, was nothing short of a catalogue of murder. Each entry read like a business contract, cold and mechanical, reducing human lives to obstacles and profit margins. A target's name. A justification phrased in chillingly sterile terms, such as market impediment or competitive interference. The chosen method of elimination, payment schedules, completion dates. It was an archive of death masquerading as ledgers of commerce. One entry recorded the resolution of Thomas Crawford, a prominent railroad executive. His life ended in a staged carriage accident on October 15, 1883, an event that paved the way for stock acquisitions totaling $180,000. Another entry listed Robert Sinclair, a shipping magnate whose addressing took the form of an apparent suicide on March 22, 1884, opening 3 lucrative trade routes for acquisition. Most monstrous of all was the fire that consumed the factory of William Hayes, a textile manufacturer, on June 2, 1885. Hayes perished along with 17 of his workers, and the ledger coldly noted the windfall insurance payouts and new opportunities valued at over $200,000. But it was not the financial gains that turned Eleanor's blood to ice. It was the revelation of the killers themselves. The conspirators maintained a stable of professional assassins, their true names concealed behind numbers. Agent 7 specialized in accidents with horses and carriages. Agent 12 engineered industrial mishaps and building fires. Agent 23 was a master of undetectable poisons, leaving behind only the guise of natural illness. This was no ad hoc alliance of greedy men. It was a structured machine of death, run with the precision of industry. Theodore's role was laid bare. He had not merely participated, he had masterminded. The strategist, the one who scoured financial records, studied market trends, and identified which rival's elimination would yield the greatest profit. His recommendations determined timing, method, and opportunity. Kensington laundered the blood-stained profits. Cromwell directed the logistics of the killings. Wainwright maintained the corrupt officials who dismissed inquiries before they began. Together, they formed a web of power that strangled competition across the Northeast. Then came the final entries. The last completed contract was dated November 10th, 1885, just 1 week before Theodore himself had died. It described the resolution of a Pittsburgh steel manufacturer whose operations threatened Wainwright's empire. But the unfinished entry below it froze Eleanor's breath in her throat. E.F. Widow, excessive curiosity. Permanent resolution required. To be arranged, the initials could belong to no one else. Elellanena Fairchild herself had become the next target. The realization shattered any remaining illusions. She was not a grieving widow prying into her husband's secrets. She was prey. Her every step, every word, every moment of solitude was being measured against a timetable of death. The hints were already in motion. Dr. Henley's whispered concerns about her mental decline, his repeated insistence that she consider rest at a sanitarium, were not compassion but preparation. The conspirators would frame her end as suicide. The inevitable collapse of a fragile woman who had never recovered from her husband's sudden death. And the attempts began. One evening, a chandelier came crashing from the dining room ceiling, striking the floor only minutes after Eleanor had stood beneath it. Days later, Margaret's sharp nose caught the hiss of gas leaking into Eleanor's bedroom. An accident that would have left her never to wake. A week later, the wheel of her carriage splintered as she rode down Fifth Avenue, sending the vehicle veering wildly before a passerby reined in the horse. Each accident bore the hallmarks of practiced hands. Each failure was a test, a rehearsal for the method that would seem most plausible. The terror was relentless. Eleanor began to question every stair she climbed, every bite she took, every servant's face in her household. Even the walls of her home, once her sanctuary, seemed alive with hidden malice. Sleep fled from her. Her reflection in the mirror stared back like that of a hunted animal. And still, Dr. Henley came now accompanied by Dr. Reginald Steinberg, a man whose specialty lay in nervous disorders and the procedures for institutional commitment. Their examinations grew invasive, their conversations heavy with insinuation. "Your mind is under strain," Mrs. Fairchild Steinberg murmured. "It would be best for your health if you allowed us to provide a proper environment for recovery." But Eleanor now understood. The sanitarium was not refuge, it was a tomb in disguise. Together, Henley and Steinberg subjected Elena to examinations that no longer resembled medicine but cross-examinations in a courtroom. Their focus was not her body, but her mind, her sanity. Did she believe people were plotting against her? Was she experiencing paranoid delusions about her husband's colleagues? Had she begun confusing reality with imagination? With every question, Eleanor saw the trap tightening. The doctors were assembling a dossier, not for her recovery, but for her removal, an airtight case, for her confinement in an asylum. She knew what awaited women in such institutions. Primitive therapies, isolation the permanent stain of madness. Death by accident was frightening. But death branded as insanity. Her voice silenced her discoveries, buried forever, was worse than death itself. And just when her plight seemed unbearable, the nightmare deepened. If this story already has you shivering, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support this channel and be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next chilling chapter. Now, let's see what Eleanor does to fight back. Her desperation crystallized into a single, dangerous resolve. She would strike first, not with violence, but with truth. Eleanor would gather undeniable evidence copies of every incriminating page, every testimony, every thread of the murderous conspiracy, and release them all at once, not just to a single authority, but to many, simultaneously. A strategy of exposure too vast for the conspirators to smother. By night, she worked in secrecy. With trembling hands, she photographed Theodore's ledger page by damning page using a small camera purchased under a false name. She wrote long, meticulous accounts of her discoveries. She secured Margaret's sworn testimony of Henley's whispered meeting with Kensington. She charted a grim timeline, mysterious deaths, each coinciding with financial windfalls that enriched her husband's circle. Each line of ink was a thread in a tapestry of murder for profit. By day she played her part. The grieving widow, the fragile woman under strain. She attended dinners, received her guests, endured Henley's prodding questions. She let the world believe she was fading, while in truth she was sharpening her weapon, the truth itself. The risks were colossal. The men she opposed had killed without hesitation, and her chance was narrowing. If they moved before she was ready, her work would die, with her swallowed in silence. But if she succeeded, the conspiracy would unravel in front of the nation. Autumn crept over New York in 1886. But Eleanor felt only the cold edge of fear as the decisive week arrived. She had chosen her allies carefully, a federal prosecutor specializing in interstate commerce crimes, the editor of the Herald Tribune, a paper beyond the conspirators' reach, and a police detective from Philadelphia, outside the grasp of New York's corruption. 3 fronts, 3 simultaneous revelations. Her strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Scatter the evidence in all directions at once, so no hand could stop them all. 4 complete sets of proof lay before her: photographs of the assassination ledger, copies of coded letters, Margaret's signed statement, and Eleanor's own detailed analysis linking bloodshed to profit. As she sealed the final packet, she felt both terror and exhilaration. The conspirators had written her name into the ledger, but she intended to write theirs into history. 3 sets of Eleanor's evidence were destined for her allies, while the 4th, her last safeguard, would be hidden in a distant bank's safety deposit box, safely beyond the conspirators' grasp. On the morning of October 8, 1886, Eleanor rose before dawn. She dressed with deliberate care as though preparing for a social engagement, though in truth, she believed it might be her final day of freedom or of life itself. Her schedule was exacting: the federal prosecutor at 10:00 a.m., the newspaper editor at 2:00 p.m., the Philadelphia detective at 5:00 p.m. Each meeting was carefully placed at different locations to reduce the chance of interception. But fate moved quicker than her caution. Her first warning came not from the streets, but from Margaret. The maid, pale and anxious, whispered that two unfamiliar men loitered at opposite corners of the mansion, watching. Worse still, Dr. Henley had arrived unannounced, dragging along his associate Steinberg. He was in the front parlor insisting Eleanor was in urgent medical crisis and that he must examine her immediately. "Ma'am, you look perfectly well," Margaret murmured, but he keeps looking at his watch. Like a man waiting for a signal, Eleanor's pulse thundered. The trap had sprung. The conspirators had learned of her plan. If she allowed Henley to see her, she would be declared unfit, spirited into confinement before she could deliver her evidence. In that instant, she chose subterfuge over confrontation. She instructed Margaret to stall Henley with the excuse that she felt faint and needed time to recover. Then, slipping to the servants' stairwell, Eleanor snatched up her packets of evidence and fled through the rear door into a narrow alley that spilled onto 48th Street. Her escape ignited a furious pursuit. As she hurried through Manhattan's crowded avenues, Eleanor spotted shadowy figures trailing her steps. Each turn of the street confirmed it. The conspiracy had unleashed its hunters. She pressed on to her first appointment, clinging to hope. But when she arrived breathless at the federal building, despair struck. The clerk at the prosecutor's office informed her that Prosecutor Williams had been called away on an urgent matter. The man's words rang hollow, his gaze fixed to the floor. Eleanor left the evidence packet regardless, but dread whispered that it would never see Williams' desk. At 2:07 p.m., the Herald Tribune delivered another blow. The editor Morrison had reportedly been taken suddenly ill that very morning and confined to hospital. The coincidence was too sharp to be chance. The conspirators had reached him before she did. Two allies lost, one left. Driven by desperation, Eleanor raced toward Grand Central Station for her last hope, Detective Patrick Kelly of Philadelphia. Their plan was simple. She would deliver her documents before he boarded the evening train, ensuring the conspiracy could not strangle the truth in New York. The vast station bustled with travelers, its cavernous halls echoing with the rhythm of departure boards and locomotive whistles. Eleanor found Kelly waiting at the agreed spot. Relief washed over her until she met his eyes. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only something colder. His first words turned her blood to ice. "Mrs. Fairchild, I've been informed about your condition. Dr. Henley has explained everything to me in detail. It was betrayal. Even here beyond New York's jurisdiction, the conspiracy's reach had ensnared him. Whether bought by bribes or swayed by lies of madness, Kelly was no savior. He was another weapon raised against her. The evidence package Eleanor had meant to place into Detective Kelly's hands would never see daylight. Her last path to justice had been closed before she could even set foot upon it. "Detective Kelly, please listen to me," she cried, desperation cracking her voice. "The evidence I have proves everything. My husband and his partners have been murdering for profit. There's a ledger, dozens of assassinations recorded. Theodore was poisoned at our own dinner table, and I can prove it." Kelly's reply was calm, almost paternal, the tone reserved for dangerous lunatics. "Mom, Dr. Henley has told me all about your delusions. You've suffered terribly since your husband's death. Grief has clouded your mind. The best thing for you now is to come with me peacefully. Dr. Henley is waiting outside with an ambulance ready to take you to a private facility where you will finally get the help you need." Eleanor's heart froze with the sudden clarity of total defeat. Every move, every plan, every contact anticipated and destroyed. The private facility was no sanctuary. It was her prison, and in time, her grave. Her death there could be written off as the slow collapse of a fragile mind. But surrender meant obliteration. In that abyss of despair, Eleanor chose one last act of defiance. If she was to be silenced, she would not go quietly. With a violent wrench, she tore herself free from Kelly's grasp and sprinted into the main concourse of Grand Central. Her voice, sharp with terror and rage, rang against the high arches as travelers froze and stared. "They killed my husband Harrison Kensington, and Marcus Cromwell are murderers. They've been killing for money." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the elegant widow dissolved into hysteria. Eleanor's cries rose higher. "Dr. Henley poisoned Theodore. They're trying to kill me because I know the truth." But the scene unfolded exactly as the conspirators had intended. Before the echo of her accusations had faded, Dr. Henley appeared flanked by two burly orderlies in white coats. His tone was solemn, his expression grave, yet full of compassion. "Please, ladies and gentlemen, give us room," he called out, projecting authority. "This poor woman has been suffering greatly since her husband's tragic death. Severe nervous exhaustion, paranoia, delusions. She believes dangerous fictions that torment her day and night. We mean only to help her." The orderlies seized her arms. Eleanor struggled furiously, screaming names, dates, crimes, all of it spilling out in a torrent that sounded more like madness than truth. The more she insisted, the more her desperation confirmed Henley's diagnosis. To the eyes of the public, her intricate warnings of conspiracies and assassinations seemed nothing more than the ramblings of a woman broken beyond repair. As they dragged her toward the waiting ambulance, Eleanor's gaze caught a figure at the station's entrance. Harrison Kensington, half shrouded in shadow, watched with chilling detachment. His expression was one of satisfaction, a predator witnessing the cage snapping shut around his prey. In that instant, Eleanor understood every accident, every diagnosis, every whispered doubt. It had all been arranged to lead her here. The last image seared into her memory. As the ambulance doors slammed closed was Detective Kelly, hand extended toward Henley, accepting an envelope thick with cash. Her final chance at justice vanished. Eleanor Catherine Fairchild was declared insane and committed on October 8, 1886, to the Westchester Private Sanitarium under the authority of Dr. Pearl Henley and Dr. Reginald Steinberg. The sanitarium sat in a secluded corner of Westchester County, far from prying eyes. It specialized in treating wealthy patients whose nervous disorders or supposed madness were too embarrassing for their families to manage publicly. It was, in truth, the perfect warehouse for inconvenient lives, a place where reputations could be preserved while people simply vanished. From the very day Eleanor Catherine Fairchild arrived, her descent was carefully documented. In Dr. Henley's first report, she was diagnosed with acute paranoid hysteria, supposedly the product of grief and exhaustion. Her insistence on conspiracies on murders carried out for profit was dismissed as the fevered inventions of a disordered female mind. Her treatment followed the merciless standards of the age isolation in a private room stripped of all contact with the outside world. No visitors were permitted beyond immediate family, and Eleanor had none left. She was subjected to cold water immersions, endless hours of forced bed rest, and a slow poisoning of her body with escalating doses of opiates meant to pacify her into silence. Every request she made to write, to speak with authorities to plead her case, was denied. Dr. Henley always signed the refusals with the same explanation such activity would only worsen her delusions. Margaret O'Brien, the loyal cook who had stood by Eleanor in the mansion's darkest days, fought desperately to see her. She was turned away again and again at the sanitarium gates. At last, Henley himself spoke to her, offering polished words about Eleanor's fragile state and the danger of outside contact. Margaret left in tears but resolved not to give up. She never got the chance. On November 15, 1886, exactly 1 month after Eleanor's commitment, Margaret O'Brien was found dead in her small apartment. The official cause, a gas leak from a faulty stove. Just another accident, the papers said. But its timing was too neat, too final. The only witness to the conversation between Kensington and Henley had been erased. Eleanor's own end came with grim inevitability. On December 3rd, 1886, less than 2 months after her confinement, she was discovered lifeless in her sanitarium room. Henley's report listed the cause as cardiac failure brought on by nervous deterioration and mental anguish. His colleague Dr. Steinberg countersigned the certificate sealing the record. Nowhere was there mention of the morphine, an overwhelming dose delivered under the guise of therapeutic treatment. The execution had been accomplished under the cover of medicine. Her funeral was modest, attended by a few loyal servants and society acquaintances who felt compelled to appear. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, and James Wainwright stood at the graveside, their masks flawless. They bowed their heads with practiced sorrow, mourning the widow's tragic decline. Their sympathy seemed genuine, exactly the right blend of grief and weary relief. The New York Times published only a short obituary. It offered no scandal, no whispers of foul play. Instead, it framed Eleanor as a tragic lesson, the widow whose grief curdled into madness, whose fevered mind spun wild stories of conspiracies and assassinations. A fragile woman destroyed not by villains but by her own sorrow, and so the truth was buried with her. The obituary in the New York Times painted Eleanor as yet another victim of female hysteria, praising Dr. Henley's heroic efforts to treat her tragic decline. It noted with clinical detachment that some minds simply could not be saved. Behind the printed words, the truth was far darker. Her estate was settled with ruthless efficiency. Cornelius Dalton, executor of her will, oversaw the liquidation of the Fairchild fortune, valued at more than $2 million. The distribution followed Theodore's earlier instructions, a blueprint that just happened to enrich his closest business partners. Harrison Kensington's bank accounts swelled with sudden deposits. Marcus Cromwell acquired shipping interests at prices that defied logic. James Wainwright consolidated textile holdings that would later anchor his empire. The mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue was sold off to a Chicago railroad magnate, while every record, every ledger, every trace of Theodore's dealings was consigned to fire. Kensington himself supervised the destruction, ensuring that not a single scrap of incriminating evidence survived. With Eleanor silenced, the machinery of murder-for-profit ground on stronger than ever. Her death was a warning, etched in silence. Those who dared to challenge the network would be erased, body and memory alike. Over the next decades, the organization expanded, pushing its influence beyond New York into the industrial arteries of the Midwest. Dr. Henley emerged untarnished, even celebrated. His success with difficult cases made him the darling of society families, eager to discreetly commit troublesome wives and daughters. His sanitarium prospered. Many patients never left alive, but mortality was blamed on the fragility of their conditions. In 1902, a fire consumed the sanitarium's archives, neatly erasing any trace of the questionable deaths within its walls. By the dawn of the 20th century, time itself had buried the conspirators. Kensington died a philanthropist, his legacy measured in hospitals and schools. Cromwell's shipping lines carried America across oceans. Wainwright's textile mills clothed the nation. Their graves bore marble tributes to industry and progress. Yet, their truest monuments were invisible networks of corruption methods, of silencing dissent blueprints for criminal empires that would echo for generations. Eleanor Catherine Fairchild vanished into the footnotes of history. In dusty academic journals, she became little more than a case study in female nervous collapse. Her warnings were dismissed. Her courage was forgotten. Her evidence was ash. The woman who had dared to confront some of the most powerful men of the Gilded Age was erased so thoroughly that even memory betrayed her. Her story, when recovered, is not just one of personal tragedy, it is a revelation of how power can twist justice, how medicine can become a weapon, and how the darkest monsters wear human faces. Eleanor's fate reminds us that history's most chilling horrors are not always supernatural, but the work of men who believe themselves untouchable. And now, dear listener, her voice reaches you through the shadows of time. What do you think? Could such conspiracies truly have thrived beneath the glittering surface of America's Gilded Age? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective on Eleanor's forgotten fight. Before we close, I want to pause and thank each and every one of you. Thanks to your support, our channel has just reached 1,000 subscribers, a milestone we could never have achieved without this community. If you've enjoyed this journey into America's darkest corners, please subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves exploring the sinister secrets that history tried to bury. Until next time, remember, the most frightening stories are not the ones that couldn't happen, but the ones that did.